there you have it. There's the story of our Lord's death. In fact, there's the crown of thorns, like what he would have worn as they were mocking him, you know. There's a cross. It's probably not as big, not as threatening as the cross that he hung on, but it's something like what they would have crucified him with. That's how it happened. So I'm guessing that for many of you, you've heard the story before. And for all of us, we know it's really not the end of the story. We know what's to come a few days later. And it makes me wonder, so hearing it again, does it stir anything up inside of you? What stirs inside? Can you imagine yourself there? Can you imagine yourself in the square? Or is it too hard because we sit in this beautiful church? Can you imagine yourself with a mob, you know, screaming, shouting? Or is it too hard because you sit next to people who most of the time are so nice and reasonable? Can you imagine that he would die on the cross when usually we worship crosses? And many of us have crosses in gold or some other way hanging from our necks. Can you imagine that that's the vehicle for execution? And can you imagine where you would have been standing as this whole thing unfolded? Maybe it started when you were in your house. And maybe a neighbor came running by and said, you got to see what's going on. Because this Jesus guy, they've arrested him now and they're going to try him. And you were cooking. You took it off the wood, the flames. You dropped everything and you ran outside. And it was hot because the sun was out, but it was hot because there was something else in the air. It was this tension, this violence that was in the air. And you're standing next to people. You're trying to sort of jockey for position. Can you imagine someone sort of pushing you from behind? You know, we Episcopalians, we sit a respectful distance from one another, you know. But can you imagine the crowd and elbow to elbow? And you're trying to look up and see what's going on too, you know. And the people around you are people that you know, they're good people. They're decent people. And they're beginning to say really violent things. These good people. And maybe you get caught up in the wave of shouting along with them. And you're sweating, and it smells of fear, and all of a sudden you realize that the hair on the back of your neck is starting to stand up. And looming over the whole scene, there is the cross. It's up on a platform, you see. And listen, the cross was the most threatening and ominous of objects back in those days. The cross was the way that authorities would say, don't you dare threaten us. Because if you do, you'll end up there. And the cross is a scary sight. And there it stands on the platform. Imagine looking at it and knowing what's to come. And then where are you standing? Are you in the middle of the crowd? Are you shouting out for them? Are you just frozen in place, not saying anything, but paralyzed by what was happening? Maybe you've moved a safer distance, away from the crowd. You're on the edge because you don't want to get caught up in it. And you don't want anyone to know that actually you've been with him yourself. And maybe it's safer to stand there too, because you can say to yourself, I have nothing to do with this, I wasn't even in the crowd. You can say that, but here's the thing that you're culpable. Whether you're in the crowd shouting, whether you're standing in the crowd silent as an innocent guy is being persecuted, whether you're along with Pilate kind of hiding behind the letter of the law because it's the easiest or the safest thing to do, or even if you're apart from the crowd, pretending you don't know the guy, and you're culpable. You're part of it. I imagine there are a few ways that we can sort of lessen the horror of this all as we hear it 2,000 years later. I mean, we can say to ourselves, I never would have been a part of that. Not me. I wouldn't have been a part of that mob mentality. I wouldn't have shouted for Jesus to be crucified. Not me. Wouldn't happen 2,000 years later. Or we can even say, you know what? But this was all part of God's plan. This was all the preparation for Easter. This was God's script. We can say that and fool ourselves. We can't fool God. Because here's the thing. No matter what's written, I do not believe that this was God's plan. That this was God's script. And that we were merely just playing our part in the drama. I don't think that God's plan was for Jesus to suffer any more than it's God's plan for you or for me to suffer. I don't believe that. God's plan was for us to know that we were loved. God's plan was for all people to come under God's embrace. God's plan was for us to know that violence and that judgment and that evil was not stronger than peace and compassion and love. God's plan was for us to know that after death there could be new life. That was all God's plan. But let me tell you, if it could have happened some other way besides hanging on the cross, I'm sure that would have been all right with God. Maybe God knew it was going to happen. Maybe God knew that Jesus' grace was so radical and so threatening that we were going to respond by rejecting him and by turning violent. Maybe God saw that coming. But we were not merely following our script and doing what God wanted us to do. Not 2,000 years ago and not today. 2,000 years ago, Jesus threatened them. You know what? 2,000 years later, Jesus is still threatening us. Jesus is still saying, don't get too comfortable. 2,000 years ago, the gospel was a message that put pressure on the people who were privileged, who were in power, who were certain about what was right, and who were on the inside of things. Who are we today? We're pretty privileged. We sit in our comfortable church. There are plenty who are clear about what's right, about who's in, and about who's out. And I know for me, I guess as for many of you, there are times when we are culpable and these sorts of stories unfolding in ways small and subtle and in ways grand and obvious. Sometimes we might sort of be angry and want for vengeance. Sometimes we might just be silent and watch something wrong unfold. Sometimes we might follow the letter of the law because it's easy. Sometimes we stand back and just watch Jesus crucified and act as if we don't even know. And that's still happening today. That's why we need to hear this story year after year. It's our story. We've got to hear this story. It's our story. Because how can we know the incredible grace and awesome love that we're going to celebrate a week from now if we don't claim this story as our story too? You might have heard people call the Episcopal Church Catholic Light, a third less guilt than your regular Catholic Church. And normally I'm really okay to claim that. I don't love the whole guilt scene. I don't think that guilt is a particularly effective way of teaching people what the right thing to do is. But on this day, I think you have to take stock in our own guilt. You just simply have to. Someone, not a churchgoer, once asked me, why do they call it the Passion story? There's some passion in it. I said to him, the passion is this. For God so loved the world that God gave His only begotten Son, that all who believe in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Could there be anything more passionate than that?